"Do not sign that," she said softly, and somehow the entire room heard it. The rain pressed against the tall glass windows like a quiet warning, streaking the city lights into blurred lines of gold and gray, while Daniel Hayes sat at the center of the table, pen hovering just above the final page of a contract that was supposed to save everything he had built over the last 15 years. His company was collapsing, not loudly but slowly, like a structure losing its foundation one unnoticed crack at a time, and tonight was supposed to be the solution, one signature in exchange for survival. Around him, the investors watched with polite smiles that did not reach their eyes, their suits perfect, their posture relaxed, as if they already knew how this would end. Emily Carter stood just behind his chair, holding a tray with 2 untouched glasses of water, her presence almost invisible in the room. Just another waitress in a quiet restaurant serving people who never looked twice at her. But her eyes did not move like someone invisible. They moved like someone reading, calculating, noticing. She had seen the document when she set it down earlier, only for a second, but sometimes a second was enough. Daniel exhaled slowly, unaware that the smallest decision could rewrite everything. He had not slept in 2 days. His board had turned against him. His partners had already begun distancing themselves. This deal was not just business, it was the last door before everything closed. "Mr. Hayes," one of the investors said calmly, "we understand the pressure you are under, which is exactly why this agreement is structured to protect both sides." Protect. The word lingered in the air like something too smooth to trust. Emily shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the tray. She had seen that word before, in contracts that did not protect but quietly transferred power, one clause at a time. Daniel lowered the pen. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. And then she spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. To him, as if unsure whether to laugh or dismiss her entirely. One of the investors let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like amusement. "Excuse me," he said, with the kind of politeness that hides irritation. "I believe this is a private discussion." Emily did not move. She did not apologize. She simply met Daniel's gaze for half a second, and in that half second there was no hesitation, no doubt, only certainty. Daniel frowned slightly, more from instinct than belief, but something about the way she had said it did not feel like a guess. It felt like a warning. His pen remained in the air. The room waited. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Inside, time slowed. And for the first time that night, Daniel Hayes did not feel in control. He felt washed by something quieter, something sharper, something that did not belong to power but understood it completely. He flipped the page back, just once, just to prove her wrong. But as his eyes scanned the lines again, slower this time, more carefully, something shifted, not in the room, but inside him. A small, unsettling realization that maybe the person who saw the most in that moment was not the man holding the pen, but the woman holding the tray. The investors remained still, their confidence unchanged. But confidence is easy when no one looks twice. Emily had looked twice, and now, so did he. The first crack did not make a sound, but he felt it. Right there, in Clause 7, hidden in language designed to be overlooked, a quiet transfer of control disguised as a safety net. Daniel's grip on the pen tightened, then loosened. He did not sign, not yet. And in that pause, everything began to change as Daniel leaned back slightly. His eyes still fixed on the document, while the room shifted from certainty to tension, subtle but undeniable, like a balance tilting just enough to be felt, but not yet seen. And the investor across from him cleared his throat softly, maintaining composure while adjusting his cufflinks, a small gesture that revealed more than words. Because control often hides in details, and Emily noticed everything. She always had, even when no one noticed her, and she stepped back half a pace, returning to her role, invisible again. But the moment had already been altered, and Daniel could feel it. The decision no longer simple, no longer automatic, and he turned another page slowly, rereading, questioning, something he had not done in weeks because pressure does not allow reflection, it demands action, and action was exactly what had brought him here, to the edge of losing everything. And now a voice that should not have mattered had interrupted that momentum, not loudly, not forcefully, but precisely. And precision is harder to ignore than noise. "Is there an issue, Mr. Hayes?" another investor asked, his tone calm, but firmer now. And Daniel looked up for the first time since she spoke, his expression unreadable, his mind moving faster than before, connecting pieces he had not seen earlier. Because sometimes the difference between collapse and survival is not knowledge, it is perspective. And Emily had just shifted his, without asking, without permission, without fear, and that alone unsettled him more than anything in the contract. Because people who are not afraid are rarely guessing. And he glanced briefly toward her, just a fraction of a second, but enough to see that she was not watching the room. She was watching him, not as a server waiting for an order, but as someone waiting for a decision. And that was the moment Daniel Hayes realized that the most important person in the room might not be sitting at the table at all. And he placed the pen down, not dramatically, just deliberately, and said quietly, "I need a minute." And for the first time that night, the investors did not immediately respond, because something had shifted, something small but irreversible, and Emily Carter turned slightly, as if nothing had happened, as if she had said nothing at all, but the truth was already there, written between the lines, waiting for someone to read it correctly. And Daniel finally did, and the night that was supposed to end his company had just begun to test it instead, not through pressure, not through force, but through a single moment of hesitation that revealed everything he had almost missed, and everything he still had a chance to save as Daniel stood up. Slowly, the chair sliding back with a soft sound that echoed louder than it should have in the tense silence. And he walked toward the window, not to escape, but to think, because thinking had become a luxury he could not afford until now. And outside the city continued as if nothing mattered, cars moving, lights shifting, rain falling. But inside that room, everything had narrowed down to one question, not whether he would sign, but whether he truly understood what he was about to give away. And behind him, Emily placed the tray down quietly on a nearby table, her hands steady, her expression unchanged, but her eyes remained sharp, focused, aware, because she had seen this before, not in this room, not with these people, but in patterns that repeat when power believes it cannot be challenged. And Daniel turned back, slower this time, his gaze moving across the investors, no longer seeing them as saviors, but as something else, something more calculated. And he returned to his seat, not rushed, not pressured, but deliberate. And he picked up the contract again, not to sign, but to understand. And that difference, small as it seemed, was everything. Because in that moment, the failing cell was no longer reacting. He was choosing. And the waitress who had spoken only once had already changed the outcome of a night that was supposed to be predictable. Because sometimes the most powerful shift does not come from authority, it comes from clarity, and clarity rarely raises its 7 again, slower now, reading not just the words but the intention beneath them. And once you start looking for intention, you begin to see what was never meant to be obvious, the phrasing, the structure, the subtle placement of authority, all carefully designed to feel safe, while quietly transferring control. And Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not panic, not yet, but awareness. The kind that comes too late for many, and just in time for a few. And he exhaled, placing the document flat on the table. "This clause," he said calmly, his voice lower but clearer than before, "gives your firm majority decision rights in operational restructuring." And one of the investors smiled politely, as if this was expected, as if this was already agreed upon. "Only as a safeguard," he replied smoothly, "in case of further instability." And the word safeguard returned, softer this time, almost reassuring. But Daniel did not look reassured. He looked focused, because now he understood something he had missed earlier, not because he lacked intelligence, but because urgency had blinded him. And urgency is often the most expensive mistake a person can make. And he leaned back slightly, his fingers resting on the edge of the table, not gripping, not tense, just steady. "A safeguard that removes control from my company the moment we need it most," he said, and the room shifted again. Subtle but undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath still water. And the investor across from him paused for half a second, just enough to confirm what Daniel was beginning to see. This was never about saving his company, it was about acquiring it at its weakest point. And that realization settled quietly, without drama, without anger, just clarity. And clarity does not need volume, It changes everything on its own. And Daniel nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, before closing the contract slowly, not slamming it, not rejecting it outright, just ending the momentum it once had. And that small gesture carried more weight than any argument, because it meant he was no longer being led, he was deciding. And across the room, Emily watched without appearing to watch, her posture unchanged, her presence still subtle, but her eyes followed the shift with quiet recognition, because she had seen that moment before, the exact second when someone stops reacting and starts thinking, and it is never loud, it is always still. And Daniel lifted his gaze, meeting the investors one by one, not with hostility, not with accusation, but with something more unsettling, awareness. "I am not signing this tonight," he said, and the words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. The polite smiles tightened, the relaxed shoulders adjusted, and for the first time, the control in the room did not belong entirely to them. And one of the men leaned forward slightly, his tone measured, careful. "Mr. Hayes, delaying this decision could have serious consequences for your company." And Daniel allowed himself a small pause before responding, not because he needed time, but because he understood the value of it now. "So could rushing it," he said simply. And the silence that followed was different from before, not frozen, not shocked, but recalibrating, as if everyone in the room was adjusting to a reality they had not planned for. And Emily turned away at that moment, picking up the tray again, stepping quietly toward the exit of the private dining room, because her part in this moment was complete. She had not come to lead, she had come to interrupt, and sometimes that is all it takes to change the outcome. And as she reached the door, Daniel's voice stopped her, not loud, not commanding, just present. "Wait," he said, and she paused, turning back slightly, her expression neutral, professional, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. And he studied her for a second, longer than before, not as a distraction, not as background, but as someone who had just altered the direction of his life with a single sentence. And there was no arrogance in her face, no expectation, just calm, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because people who expect nothing are rarely motivated by the same things as everyone else. "What did you see?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried everything behind it: curiosity, doubt, recognition. And Emily did not answer immediately. She stepped closer to the table, placing the tray down again with quiet precision, her movements unhurried, her voice steady. "You were not reading it," she said, and the words were not an accusation, they were a fact. And Daniel blinked once, caught off guard not by the content, but by the clarity. "I read every page," he replied, almost defensively, and she shook her head slightly, not dismissive, just certain. "You looked at it," she corrected gently, "but you did not question it." And the difference between those two things hung in the air, undeniable. And Daniel leaned back again, slower this time, absorbing not just the contract, but the moment. Because sometimes the real mistake is not what you miss, it is why you miss it. And across from them, the investors watched in silence, no longer interrupting, no longer guiding, because something had shifted beyond their control. And Emily glanced briefly at the document, then back at him. "When people are desperate," she continued softly, "they stop asking why." And Daniel felt that land deeper than anything else that night, because it was true, not just about this deal, but about everything that had led him here, every rushed decision, every ignored instinct, every moment he chose speed over understanding. And he nodded slowly, not in agreement with her, but in recognition of himself. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, the pressure in his chest eased slightly, not because the problem was solved, but because he could finally see it clearly. And clarity, even when it hurts, is always a form of relief. And Emily stepped back again, returning to her role, because she did not stay where she was not needed. And as she turned to leave once more, Daniel spoke again, quieter now, but more certain. "Thank you," he said, and she paused just long enough to acknowledge it with the smallest nod before walking out of the room, leaving behind not just a table of investors and a contract, but a decision that would no longer be made in blindness. And as the door closed softly behind her, Daniel Hayes looked down at the document one last time, then pushed it gently across the table, not as rejection, not as defiance, but as understanding, because the night was no longer about saving his company quickly, it was about saving it correctly, and that difference, subtle and silent, would define everything that came